Authentic direct communication, I think, is the one thing from the Trump campaign that now will change all campaigns. That a lot of it was sui generis to him, like he's a reality TV star, he's Donald Trump, like you're not going to duplicate that. But what I think that you will have in future campaigns is the effort to have the authentic direct communication. I think the effort to run a presidential campaign from a TV studio a la Marco Rubio, I don't think people will try that in the future.
Hi everyone, I'm Ian Bremmer and welcome to your GZERO World. You see, I'm in a suit and that in New York kind of means, almost by definition, that it's United Nations Week. The General Assembly with all the leaders of the world coming into a city that already feels kind of globalized, making it even more of a melting pot. All of these diplomats meeting together, making traffic absolutely impossible and making it clear to me that I would never want to be Secretary of State because the schedules are just insane. The most excitement, of course, came from the fact that this was the first time that President Trump ever addressed this group. And, Trump himself is kind of the antithesis of the United Nations, the UN set up by America after World War II to really be the most global, the most multilateral institution in the world, prevent future wars from occurring, common values, really important, the Declaration of Universal Human Rights. Trump thinks that common values undermine relationships. They make it easier for other countries to take advantage of the US, not pay as much as they really should. We should be doing transactions with anyone we want so that it's useful for us at the time. The other really interesting thing is that a lot of countries that were really important, of course, weren't here at the highest levels. We had Xi Jinping from China, we had Narendra Modi from India, we had Vladimir Putin from Russia, all of whom met at their own BRICS summit just a few weeks ago. And you just know they said to each other, do we really need to go all the way to the United States and do this again? Or is our event just okay, let's send somebody else? Germany's Angela Merkel wasn't here either because she has elections coming up very shortly. But otherwise, almost everyone was, and my God, there was a lot to talk about. The big news of the week, of course, was President Trump's plenary to the General Assembly. Perhaps the most surprising bit was the idea that a sitting American president would use the United Nations to threaten total destruction of another country, something you usually save for a phone call or an email. That surprised people. The general speech itself, though, the tenor of it, I would say was much more within the broad confines of what we have heard from other presidents historically, and as a consequence, there wasn't that much overreaction, certainly not from the heads of state, foreign ministers that I spoke with. They thought it was all okay. But if you want to really dive into the speech itself, a couple things that I would note. Focus on sovereignty. Trump mentioned sovereign and sovereignty 21 times in his speech. The idea that a country has dominion over what it does internally, other countries should butt out, the kind of thing you'd hear from China, say 10, 20 years ago. Obama, on the other hand, used the word international some 14 times in his opening speech, always in a positive way, international cooperation. Trump used it 3 times in a negative way, international criminal networks, for example. So, it's very clear that Trump as a president sees multilateral institutions as constraining, not as an opportunity, and that the United Nations is not a grouping that builds community. It's rather a place where countries around the world can express their own national interests to each other, working together as useful, not working together when it doesn't make sense. The most fun and headline-driving piece, of course, was when Trump referred to the North Korean leader as Rocket Man, not even mentioning his name. North Korean ambassador wasn't there to hear it. He actually took off before the speech even started. When he talked about human rights, here's what Mugabe had to say. Yeah, he was sleeping, but he's in his 90s, so you can expect that. And when he talked about refugees and how migration is a problem, here's the Syrian response. Yeah, not very impressed either. But that's a rogues gallery. We have a new axis of evil. He talked about Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela. You can't say it about Iraq anymore as being the new rogue states. But again, the takeaway over the course of the week, this isn't a disaster. I've met with at least 10 heads of state, probably 30 foreign ministers, and there were very few that were saying this was a train wreck, this is a dumpster fire. It wasn't the media response you've typically seen to Trump. Instead, it was okay, we know the rhetoric is bad, but we're starting to recognize that we can still work with the United States. We've developed our relationships with the cabinet, with the UN ambassador. Here's the way we can work together. Could have been a lot worse for his first week at the United Nations. Hi, I'm Ian Bremmer. Today I have for you Mike Allen, who is the genius and founder and executive editor behind Axios, sort of the ultimate Washington insider. We've known each other for a long time. We're sitting here at Danny Meyer's Union Square Cafe, also an institution, though of the New York variety as opposed to Washington,
I love
DC.
that we're getting out to Manhattan in order to really get in touch with the heartbeat of America.
That's what you need to do, all right? Or the heart and beat of something. But no, Mike, well, you and I, we bracket the Acela corridor. Boston, no one really cares about that. I don't think they even think of that when they see the Acela corridor.
Come on,
right?
we're big in Boston. Come on.
Axios is big in Boston.
No, you are. Ian Bremmer's big everywhere.
Bremmer's huge in Boston, no question. Look, let's talk about
From Boston to Beijing. That could be your new deal.
We're going to talk Trump. We're going to talk Trump administration. We're going to talk the swamp. But let's talk first the single thing that just happened, like literally a couple of hours ago. Sean Spicer, former press secretary, now not on Dancing with the Stars, on the Emmys, and suddenly just kind of cut you off this morning, said, I'm getting my lawyers on you. Like, what is that all about?
So I got this tip that Sean, when he was working at the Republican National Committee, when he was working at the Trump campaign, when he was working in the White House, that he took copious notes when he was at the RNC. They had these black notebooks with the party logo. I'm just going to show you the text. The party logo on it, and he would take very detailed notes. Now suddenly,
The kind of thing that someone like Mueller might be interested
well, that's
in.
just it. Now that he's become such a vacuum cleaner, as Brian Williams said on MSNBC last night, this is a new light for these notebooks. And the way it came up, a top White House official said to me, people are going to wish that they'd been nicer to Sean. He was in a lot of meetings, and so he has all these notes. So after I got this tip, I just shot Sean a note asking him about it. Thanks to his story, a lot of texts have come in. So here we go. So I asked him about the notebooks, and this was his response.
Mike, please stop texting, emailing me unsolicited anymore. Shall I continue?
Sure.
Sure, Mike Allen, question mark. Sean, not sure what that means. Question mark is, I don't know, it's just an interrogative.
You never know.
From a legal standpoint, I want to be clear, capital, do not email or text me again. Should you do again, I will report to the appropriate authorities. And that's the end of that.
So this is puzzling for a couple of reasons.
It is.
One, Sean now is out of government, and you might have thought that he was making a pivot to advising on crisis comms or engaging.
My presumption would be this is a guy who suddenly is quite concerned that he's going to be caught up in potentially career.
You don't know. And I will say, just to help your listeners and viewers think through some of the stuff they've been reading about Mueller. So the Washington Post reported that 6 White House officials, including Spicer, were on a list of people that Robert Mueller had given to the White House, saying he was probably going to want to talk to them. These are current and former White House officials. Chief of Staff Reince Priebus, the former press secretary Sean Spicer. They can help Robert Mueller's prosecutors understand how things worked, who might have talked to whom about something. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're being looked at themselves.
Right, fair enough. And I wonder if, obviously Steve Bannon, once he was removed, says, I'm going to be more powerful outside the White House than I was inside it. I certainly didn't find that credible at the time, but he was a voice for Trump needs to be unleashed. The person that, of course, is most unorthodox in terms of the role in the administration is Jared Kushner. And I'm wondering, I mean, he's supposed to do the China trip, then he's not doing the China trip.
By the way, in a draft, this didn't go out, but in a draft the other day, Jonathan Swan, my colleague, caught this. I called him Jared Trump, and so maybe that's a Freudian upgrade there.
Yeah, indeed. But although sort of with the certainly to the extent that one of the two of them seems to be more influential, you'd have to go to the boy on this one than you would with Ivanka, at least so far.
Over the course of the campaign, the early part of the administration, people like the idea that you can't always sell your idea to the president, but if you reach Jared Kushner, if you reach Ivanka, you have a very good chance of having that idea reach the president. The one thing that people praise this West Wing for, and you talk to CEOs, you talk to even labor leaders, people who go in there, it's much more freewheeling. And the president goes in there, he'll have a meeting in the Roosevelt Room, going back to his reality TV days, he calls it the boardroom. The president goes in there and business comes in and he'll say, what can I do for you? And nobody said that to business in decades, maybe ever. And it's very flat, and if you can convince the economic advisor, Gary Cohn, that something's a good idea, if you can convince Jared Kushner that something is a good idea, it might happen.
What do you think Jared's role actually is today?
Well, he has a big portfolio. His most his real role, not on paper, is that if you really want to convince the president of something, that's probably the best place to go. But then his formal portfolio, he's this White House's point of contact to the Xi office. Amazing, right? And he's technically in charge of the Middle East negotiations. An astonishing portfolio.
We saw Trump's willing to talk about anything, willing to talk to anyone. When you're talking to people, and Axios is read by people all over the heartland, what's the thing that they're most surprised by?
The number one thing people want is to understand it better. So much of the coverage of Trump is what I call the NASCAR effect. And that is that people just want to see the flaming tires and the bent metal, right?
Yes, for this week, for me, it was Rocket Man. It was the most nothing thing from an international relations thing that happened the entire week, and yet it drove headlines all week long.
All over the world.
And he knew that was going to happen, which is why he did it, and it was completely meaningless. Another shiny object.
Right? Exactly.
Yeah.
And so what Axios tries to do is get past the shining objects and actually illuminate things. So our CEO, Jim Bandahai, always says there's enough noise out there. So I got a letter from a reader the other day, an email from a reader that I shared with the whole staff because I thought it was such a great way to put it. They described Axios as their noise-canceling headphones. And so that's what we try to be, is help people understand what's going on, what drives the president, how he makes decisions, some of the things that you and I have been talking about today, and facts matter.
So now give me a couple of things that you see are facts that you think are generally widely misunderstood.
People pay more attention to the words and the tweets, like what he says, whereas I say, look at what he does. And I'm going to ask you if you agree with this, and I'm going to ask you to rebut because you would know the nuances of it a million times better than I would. But by and large, if you look at what he's actually done on national security and foreign policy, I feel like it's pretty much within the 40-yard lines of what Republicans would do, of what a President Rubio or a President Jeb Bush would do. How much do you agree or disagree with that?
Now, after 9 months, probably agree with 75% of that. I think withdrawal from TPP, withdrawal from Paris Climate Accords, and the Riyadh.
Paris is the huge exception, no doubt.
And the Riyadh, going to Riyadh first, which also facilitated the Saudi versus Qatar blow-up. I would say those are the three things that you wouldn't have expected from any one Republican or Democratic side on foreign policy. Everything else in terms of actual policy, yes. Then there's the question of, irrespective of that, given who he is he driving a whole bunch of people to act in ways internationally they otherwise wouldn't act, and that's a soft power problem. That's a different story. So does that mean that that wonderful quote, don't take Trump literally, take him seriously, what percentage of that do you agree with?
I don't know. I think there's lots of different ways that you could read that, but I think something very fascinating that you and I talked about on the walk over here, what's so powerful right now is authenticity. Authentic direct communication, I think it's the one thing from the Trump campaign that now will change all campaigns. That a lot of it was sui generis to him, he's a reality TV star, he's Donald Trump, you're not going to duplicate that. But what I think that you will have in future campaigns is the effort to have the authentic direct communication. I think the effort to run a presidential campaign from a TV studio a la Marco Rubio, I don't think people will try that in the future. As you know, we mean worthy in Greek, as Axios, iOS, and the idea is worthy audience, worthy journalists, and worthy of your time, attention, and trust. And you and I were just talking about the fact that people don't know what to trust, especially since this election, and rightly so. Like what we're learning now about the way that some of the social media posts were corrupted, either because they were fake news and they were spread around, or they were paid propaganda. Understandably, people are even more likely to throw up their hands because it's harder for us to know in our feed what's true. And that's why it's even more important to look for Ian Bremmer or the Eurasia Group or Axios or Jonathan Swan or Mike Allen or our colleagues. And the people who are watching this and listening to this, by definition, agree with that. That means that they're hungry for illumination as opposed to just the fire.
Mike Allen, Axios. I got to say, there aren't many must-reads around there these days on Washington, and I consider you to be, for me, and I hope for a lot of our watchers out there, an absolute must-read. Every morning, Mike Allen, thanks for being with me.
Thank you for the honor of being here, and likewise, and appreciate being in this fantastic set.
Cheers.